Today we're going to be talking about the GRACE model that was developed by Bozard and Sanders in 2011. Basically, this model is to help students or clients, whoever you're working with, incorporate their spiritual identities and their sexual identities into one cohesive whole. So for a long time running, in the gay community, it's almost been a choice that an individual has had to make. Either they identify as spiritual or they identify as part of the gay community or with their sexual identity. So what we're really focusing on with the GRACE model is to help them incorporate these two different identities into that one cohesive whole. And this really does help improve the quality of life for individuals that are struggling with their sexuality and their spiritual identity. If they're able to incorporate it, research has really shown that it's been a huge help for them. In a study done by Folkman, Chesney, Pollack, and Phillips in 1992, those individuals that had a spiritual connection were less likely to engage in unprotected anal sex. So that has to deal more with the individual's sense of self-esteem and being able to kind of find a greater purpose for themselves in life. So the spiritual component really does help these individuals. So the first part that you really want to get in with the student or the client or whomever you're working with is to first address desire. So are they really wanting to talk about their spiritual identity and their sexual identity together? They may not. It's always okay to ask the student or the client if they want to discuss these things, but a better way to really go about this is to kind of let them guide where they want you to go. So if they come in to speak with you and they really want to discuss these issues, that would be a great time to use some of the things that I'm going to present to you here today. Otherwise, I would recommend not bringing up this model or addressing those issues. Just because the student comes in doesn't necessarily mean they are struggling with their spirituality. So with that, we're going to go ahead and begin our demonstration.
Hi, thanks for letting me come and talk to you.
Come on in, take a seat. How can I help you?
Well, I've been struggling a little bit lately with the fact that I'm gay and I go to church and all that.
Okay. That's not an uncommon problem. What's going on?
Well, my family is super, super Christian, and I guess it's a big part of my identity too. And I guess I should just pick. I can either be Christian or I can be gay, and I don't want to disappoint my family, so...
Hold up. It sounds like you're really struggling with your sexual identity and your identity as a Christian. Believe it or not, you can have both.
That's not possible.
Tell you what, how about we talk about homosexuality and religion and spirituality a little bit further. If you don't like what I have to say, you can leave it at the door when you go. However, I might say something that you will find really helpful. You've got nothing to lose.
All right, what do you want to know?
Okay. At this point, we get into the actual GRACE model. So the first letter in GRACE is G, and it represents goals. So at this time, you really want to get into the religious history for that particular student or client. So how did they grow up? Their origin or their religion of origin, which is the religion they grew up with in their family. You really want to address that and talk about basically those experiences and what they dealt with as they were growing up. So as they talk about these different experiences with religion and spirituality, you're going to see some affective considerations or emotions. So what are they expressing as they're talking? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Maybe it's joy. But really getting into those emotions surrounding their experiences as they grew up. At this point, then you want to go ahead and create kind of a list of goals or really identify some clear-cut goals that the client or the student wants to discuss with you. Those could be basically what kind of church or worship they want to participate in, but this is really looking at practical things that the client wants to do. And an assessment of their readiness is always important. So going in, you may feel comfortable going through the entire GRACE model with the client. However, the client may not be ready for that yet. So always checking in and saying things like, we've talked for a while. Are you comfortable continuing talking, or would you like to pick this up at a later date? Things like that can really help the client pace themselves and get at the heart of the issue. So tell me about growing up as a Christian.
Well, we're a super tight-knit family. Church was never optional. I remember once during a rebellious period, I stopped going to church because I realized that I wasn't exactly, straight. My parents were furious. I ended up going with them because I felt so guilty. One time at church, the priest dedicated a sermon to the wrongs of homosexuality. I felt disgusting. Another time, a close friend of ours came out as gay, and they stopped coming to church. My family doesn't talk about it.
It sounds like there's been some pretty negative experiences in your life regarding religion. How about any positive ones?
Well, my one-on-one relationship with God is pretty strong. I find it easier when I can simply talk to Him without having any interference.
Prayer is an incredibly personable and important part of spirituality and religion, and that's always going to be something that's available to you.
I guess that's true.
So what is it exactly you would like to get out of your Christian faith? If you could picture it in your head exactly the way it should be, how would it look?
Well, I do enjoy my personal one-on-one time with God, and I guess it would be really nice to find a congregation that is, warmer. Now that I think about it, my parents don't care what kind of church I go to, so long as I go.
Great. There are definitely some options available to you in regards to different means of worship. We've gone over some of your religious history, and we've discovered a solid goal. Do you feel okay continuing this conversation, or do you want to pick it up at a later date?
We can keep going.
At this point, we discuss the R of grace, which stands for renewal of hope. A lot of members of the gay community, the LGBTQIA community, grow up with religion and experience it as shameful. They may experience loneliness, rejection, and sometimes even abuse. So it's really important for you to offer new interpretations of the Bible or anything else that they may bring up to you when they discuss their religious history or their religious past. So, let's talk about the messages you receive from your church. Earlier you said that you want a congregation that is warmer. What did you mean by that?
Well, there are a few instances. At one sermon, our priest compared homosexuality to pedophilia, and that was uncomfortable. And then another time, a long-standing member of the community walked past and muttered, "I don't want to say." It was unpleasant.
I couldn't imagine being around that much hostility.
Well, I get it. The Bible doesn't accept homosexuality, so technically they are in the right.
Does it now? Did you know that in a study done by Brawley in 1996, the few passages that are frequently cited condemning homosexuality are thought by scholars to have been unrelated or only slightly related to the LGBT experience? There is also no written record of Jesus discussing the subject, and according to Foucault 1978, the concept of sexual orientation was not even known to biblical authors. In fact, the term homosexuality wasn't introduced until the 19th century.
Wow, I didn't know all that.
Well, the point I'm getting at is that no one knows exactly what the Bible says about homosexuality as we understand it today.
Wow. Maybe that's good to hear. Maybe I can have both. Maybe I can hold on to my beliefs and my religion while getting to know my sexual orientation.
I'm glad you think so, and I can help you with that. Do you still have time to continue talking?
Yes, we can keep going.
At this point, we enter the A phase of grace, which stands for action. During this phase, you discuss three particular topics: remain, renew, or create. Each one has its own avenue. If the client or the student decides to remain, they are staying in their current spiritual situation. So whatever church or place of worship they participate in, whatever spiritual community, they are remaining exactly where they are. They also have the option to renew. Renewing would be keeping the same fundamental principles that they have in their current spirituality, but making certain changes. So maybe changing churches within their denomination, maybe changing the spiritual groups that they follow, things of that nature. The third option for the client or the student is also to create a completely new sense of spiritual identity. So this would be starting from scratch. So anything that they got from their religion of origin when they were growing up, they would discard and completely recreate. At this point, it's important to consider a practical consideration, which is their presentation of their sexual identity. So when they approach whatever new organization or place of worship that they are planning on becoming a part of, it's really important for the client or student to consider, how out do you want to be? Do you want to come into your church or place of worship and not tell a single person about your sexual orientation or your sexual identity? Or do you want to come in and say, hey, I'm gay, I'm a lesbian, I identify as transgendered. What does your church, or how does your church view these individuals? And figure it out right off the bat. Or they can do some combination of the two, where basically they're sort of out to their new church community. This is something you really want to help your client or student work through. An important thing for you as a counselor or professor or whomever is helping this particular individual is contacting that particular place of worship. Simply going online and looking at a website and determining their acceptance or their philosophy regarding homosexuality is not enough. This is because the organization may support or accept members of the gay community. However, that particular church culture within your city or community may not be as accepting as the broader organization. So you really need to talk to a pastor, religious leader, clergyman, whomever at the place that the individual is planning on attending, and making sure that they do accept homosexuality, that they do accept different sexual orientations before sending anyone there. That's incredibly important. Timing, prioritizing, and resources is also incredibly important at this point. The student or client really needs to be comfortable with when they go to this particular place of worship if they're choosing to create or even renew. They need to feel that they are going into a situation that they can handle. Maybe it's a social activity at that particular place of worship, something that they feel comfortable doing. Also, they need to be able to access resources. So after this particular experience, they will have someone that they can talk to immediately about the experience. If it was good, that person can share in kind of the joy that that client or student is feeling. If it was a bad experience, then that individual can help reinforce and remove any feelings of being unclean or dirty or disgusting, however that particular place of worship chose to frame them in that negative light. So you really need to have some sort of a support immediately after the individual experiences their new place of worship. All right. I know we spoke about this briefly before, but take a moment and think about your current position in your spirituality. Do you want to remain where you are in your church, congregation, and faith, and just make a few changes? Do you want to renew your spirituality through new methods or practices, or do you want to start over and create a completely new sense of spirituality? Don't worry, your decision is not set in stone, and you're free to change your mind in the future. Do any of those choices really jump out at you?
Well, I am thinking about getting out of my church. It's just gotten so bad. I think holding on to some key elements while renewing everything would be really nice. I'm also interested in paganism too, though maybe. I don't know exactly what I want.
No worries. You've already given me plenty to go on. It sounds like you want a new church that has some of the same traditional elements but has a warmer stance towards the gay community without going overboard. We can also address paganism at a later point if you're still interested.
Yes, that would be perfect.
All right. Now, how out do you want to be at your new church? You can either walk in and make it obvious by asking what the church does for its gay members, or you can keep it completely concealed. You can also do something that is somewhere in between.
Well, what if I kept it to myself at first, and then once I got to know more members of the congregation, I could start telling people?
Perfect. That's an excellent approach. Now let's take a look at the logistics. I have here a list of accepting churches and spiritual organizations that I got from my Safe Zone facilitators. Let's look through some of these and then pick a time when you will make a visit to the new spiritual community and who you can talk to if you need support.
All right, that sounds like a plan.
So now we move on to the E of grace, or on to the C of grace, which stands for connection. This is where the individual really explores their connection with their higher power or God, or however they choose to phrase it. So at this point, you really want to examine any kind of guilt that might be there surrounding their sexual identity, any sense of divine judgment that they might feel from their higher power, as well as how they think their higher power views same-sex romantic attractions or sexual attractions, or even physical intimacy. So if they view it as sinful or anything along those lines, it's something that would need to be addressed. So you're really looking at the internal conflict going on within the client or student at this point, and you're helping them integrate all of these different identities, their religious, their sexual identities, into that one cohesive whole. So you can really start this by offering up a new image of spirituality for that client or student. So you could reinterpret Bible verses for them, help them correct their negative thoughts in regards to their religion, spirituality, and sexuality, and keeping in mind while you go about this that it's going to take time for that individual. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. Their sense of spirituality and sexual identity is something that they've kept with them or have been creating ever since they were born, or ever since they came out, and it's going to take time to reform that. Also, it's important to have them remember that just because they receive a negative message at their church or their place of worship does not mean that the negative message is coming from a source of spirituality or religion. It may be coming from that individual church member or member of that worship community. Some examples would be homophobia. So that individual member may not totally understand what it is to be gay, or they may have a negative view on what people within the gay community do or what their lives are like. It may also be heterosexist privilege. So many times people may exercise this privilege without even being aware of it, and are completely unaware that they're hurting or saying negative things towards that member of the gay community. It could also be an inaccurate stereotype. So, for example, they may view all gay men as sexually promiscuous, unable to commit, anything along those lines. So they have an inaccurate stereotype coming in, and that stereotype is what's fueling their discrimination, not a sense of spirituality or religion that comes from a source of higher thinking. Most importantly, the client needs to be accepting of themselves. So how do they understand their sexual identity and their spiritual identity? How do they put these two together? Has God created them perfectly in His design? Maybe that's how they go about incorporating these two ideas. God is perfect. God only does things that are perfect, and my sexual orientation, my behaviors are part of that design, so I have nothing to be ashamed of. Some clients or students may choose a different route and say, well, I think my behavior is still sinful. It's still not appropriate in the eyes of God. However, God forgives. My higher power forgives me. So it's okay, and I'm not going to deny my sexual identity. As kind of a method to really get in there for a client who's having a deep struggle internally with accepting themselves, a good way to phrase it is, I as a counselor, I as a teacher, I as a friend, however you relate to this particular client, I can accept you, and I have all my human flaws, my sinful nature, however the client experiences spirituality, you can phrase it in that way. So I have all these flaws, and yet I'm able to accept you. So wouldn't your higher power, wouldn't God, whomever it is, be able to be infinitely more accepting of who you are as an individual, your sexual identity and your spiritual identity together as one? It's a very powerful way to get in tune with that client and help them understand what they're feeling and how their higher power views them. Okay, so we have decided that in 2 weeks you will visit the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. Afterwards, if you feel that you need to talk to someone about the experience, you will be able to talk to your friend Becca, and I will also be available to talk. How does all this sound?
It just seems like a lot all at once. I feel like God is judging me for leaving my current church, and even more so for holding on to my sexual identity.
What you're experiencing is pretty common. Working on your spiritual identity can be exhausting because you're essentially changing the foundations of your life. Here's a little bit more research that might offer you some comfort. In a study done by Brawley in 1996, only 7 passages within the Bible reference sexual orientation. When these passages were further examined by Brawley and Helmanack in 2000, it was discovered that these passages do not condemn our present-day understanding of homosexuality. In fact, according to Brawley 1996, Helmanack 2000, and Syker 1996, these passages were meant to address idolatry, inhospitality, pedestry, and prostitution.
That's an overload of statistics.
I understand. I definitely am not expecting you to all of a sudden feel enlightened because I've thrown a bunch of research at you. This process takes time. I just want you to know that there are people out there who support you and don't think homosexuality is wrong. In fact, much of the discrimination you face may be based in homophobia, heterosexist privilege, and inaccurate stereotypes, not religious or spiritual grounding.
Maybe.
Tell you what, I'm not an expert on spirituality and how you should make sense of all this information. However, I bet this pastor at your new church could shed some light on some of your concerns. Just keep in mind that the more you accept yourself, the more sense this will make. Plus, if I, a human counselor, can accept you for who you are, then shouldn't God be infinitely more accepting?
That's a really good point. I feel much calmer about the situation now. Thank you for all your help.
No problem, and you're free to come back at any time. So at this point, we enter the final phase of the GRACE model, which is E, or empowerment. So Maureen would go off and experience her new place of worship, her new sense of spirituality, and afterwards she would come back, and this is where empowerment would really take place. If it's a negative experience, if she has a negative kind of interaction with her new place of worship, you would sit down and you would talk about what that means to her and how she's interpreting it. There might be thoughts of, I'm sinful, I'm unclean, I have flaws, this is wrong, and it's really important for you to support her or your client and encourage them to rethink those ideas. To say that, you know, there are places that do not accept your who you are as a person, your sexual identity, but there are places that do, and we can work together to find those places that are, and you shouldn't give up because of this negative experience. If, on the other hand, it's a positive experience, that's a really good time to kind of share in their joy with what's happened. So, great, I'm glad you were able to find a place where you can really relate or have a community that supports you. How else are you going to get involved? Were there any groups that they talked about that you were interested in? Was there any kind of social gatherings you're thinking about going to? Any of those kinds of things would be a really good way to push them back towards that supportive community. Again, it's really important to make sure you talk to the church or place of worship before you send the student or client there. You want to make sure that they are an accepting place so that your client or student does not have that negative experience. So I also want to put in a little bit of a disclaimer here. This is not an attempt to train you on how to use this model. It's basically just a way to show you how someone would go about working with a client or student that's struggling with their spiritual identity and their sexual identity. So if at any point you ever feel uncomfortable or you're not comfortable having this conversation in the first place, don't do it. You can always refer to a professional counselor who is trained in how to handle these issues, and you can also always refer to whatever counseling services are at your university, staff, things like that. So make sure that when the student or client leaves, they have some sort of a referral that they can talk to, even if you feel that the conversation went well. And with that, that will conclude our presentation.